the lamps flickered low against the soot-stained walls of London, where fog rolled like a shroud across cobblestone streets. It was the late 1800s, an age that called itself enlightened, yet shadows clung to every parlor, factory, and hospital ward. This was the era when women, dressed in heavy gowns that weighed more than their own fragile frames, walked with ghostly stillness. Doctors, priests, and newspapers gave them names that were whispered with dread: hysterics, invalids, zombies. The word was never meant in the way we know it today. It was a cruel shorthand, a way to describe women who seemed drained of life, pale, silent, their eyes ringed with exhaustion. But behind the nickname lay a story of suffocating social rules, unseen illnesses, and a medical system that rarely listened to women's voices. Victorian England thrived on progress. Steam engines thundered across the countryside, the telegraph carried words faster than ever before, and factories roared with invention. But inside the home, life for women was frozen in a rigid script. A woman of status was expected to be delicate, almost ornamental, her worth measured by obedience, grace, and silence. Doctors believed that too much learning, too much thinking, could damage her fragile body. They insisted her role was to conserve energy for childbearing, even if it meant she spent hours each day confined to couches, reclining chairs, and darkened rooms. And so, entire generations of women grew up under the weight of restriction, their lives shaped less by what they wanted and more by what society demanded. It was in this climate that the haunting image of the living dead began to appear. Take the story of Clara Hastings. She was 22 when she married a rising lawyer who adored her beauty but feared her wit. Clara had loved books since she was a girl, Milton, Shakespeare, even daring philosophers, but in her new home, she was told to set them aside. Her days became measured by the clock. Breakfast served at 9. A slow, quiet walk at noon. Tea at 4. Dinner with her husband's colleagues at 7, where she was expected to smile but not speak too much. Clara's health began to decline within a year. Her skin grew pale. She fainted often. Doctors prescribed what they called the rest cure, a treatment that demanded complete inactivity. She was forbidden from reading, writing, or even speaking for long stretches. A nurse fed her rich meals heavy with cream and beef, while Clara lay motionless on a bed, her body swelling while her spirit shrank. Neighbors whispered about her strange condition. "She looks like a ghost," one said. "Like a corpse that keeps breathing," another muttered. Thus the word spread. Women like Clara, drained of vitality and chained by medicine that misunderstood them, were likened to zombies. The label had power. It was repeated in magazines and casual gossip, until it became a symbol of the Victorian woman herself. Doctors filled journals with theories about why so many middle and upper-class women seemed lifeless. Some blamed fashion, the crushing corsets that squeezed ribs and lungs until breathing became shallow. Others blamed the atmosphere of the cities, thick with coal smoke and damp fog. But more often, they blamed the women themselves. Too much emotion. Too much imagination. Too much desire to be something more. Instead of listening, society chose to silence them further. Yet beneath the quiet suffering, there was resistance. Women began to write secretly, scribbling journals at night or hiding pages beneath mattresses. One of the most famous was Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who endured the rest cure and nearly lost her mind under its suffocating rules. Her story, The Yellow Wallpaper, captured the horror of being trapped inside a room, dismissed as fragile when all she needed was freedom. But Gilman was only one voice among thousands. Letters survive from nameless women who begged doctors to treat them as thinking, feeling beings. Mothers wrote to sisters, describing the crushing weight of depression, though the word depression was rarely spoken then. Instead, they called it melancholia, or worse, female weakness. What made the image of the zombie so chilling was its accuracy to the eye. A drawing room filled with reclining women looked more like a sick ward than a place of leisure. Faces blank, skin chalk white, movements slow and uncertain. But beneath that stillness, emotions churned. Anger. Loneliness. An ache for something more than endless teacups and embroidery. The industrial world was booming outside their windows, iron bridges, locomotives, new sciences, and yet women were told that too much engagement with such things would shatter their health. It was as if society wanted them to remain half alive, observers instead of participants. And so the myth deepened. Men joked in clubs that their wives were asleep with their eyes open. Medical reports described patients who were ambulatory but lifeless. By the 1880s, the metaphor of the living dead clung tightly to the female body. But what those reports never captured were the stories of endurance. Women who forced smiles at dinner parties while silently counting the hours until solitude. Daughters who longed to study but were told the effort would damage their wombs. Mothers who raised children while their own health failed, yet who still found strength to keep the household alive. One evening in 1885, Clara Hastings gazed into her mirror. Her reflection startled her: sunken cheeks, hollow eyes, lips that had forgotten the color of joy. Her husband, busy with court cases and parliamentary debates, barely noticed the transformation. But Clara did. She touched the glass as though reaching for a stranger. And in that moment, she realized the cruelest truth: society had written her into a role she had never agreed to play. Was she doomed to remain this pale figure, moving through the halls like a shadow? Or could she, like others beginning to whisper of reform, find the courage to step beyond the boundaries of her age? The Victorian zombie woman was not a monster. She was a reflection of what happens when human beings are denied agency, silenced, and misunderstood. Behind the blank stares and fragile bodies lay hearts that beat fiercely, even when the world refused to hear them. And while history remembers the term as a curiosity, the lived reality was anything but. It was pain, suppression, and the quiet rebellion of women who wanted more than society dared to allow. But the story does not end here. The tide of change was building. Whispers of suffrage, of education, of women's voices rising in parliament and press, were beginning to spread. Clara Hastings would soon face a choice that echoed across her generation: remain silent and fade into the ghostly image society had given her, or step into the unknown, risking ridicule and punishment, for a chance at life fully lived. And as London's fog thickened around her window that night, she closed her eyes and drew a breath deeper than she had in years, as though preparing for something yet to come. The night air seeped through the cracks of Clara Hastings' window, cool and damp, carrying the distant rumble of carriage wheels and the faint hiss of gas lamps. She pressed her hand to the glass, her reflection merging with the fog outside, and for a fleeting second, she imagined herself dissolving into the mist. But the breath she had taken, the deliberate, deeper breath, lingered within her. It was a quiet rebellion, almost imperceptible, yet for Clara it marked the first time in years that she felt a sense of ownership over her own body. The rest cure had nearly hollowed her out. Weeks spent in silence, forbidden from lifting a book or touching pen to paper, had stripped her spirit thin. Her physician, Dr. Renford, assured her husband that confinement was necessary, that a woman's nerves could not withstand the weight of too much stimulation. Yet Clara knew the truth: it was not nerves that plagued her. It was longing. Longing to speak freely, to read until her eyes watered, to walk until her lungs filled with clean country air. Longing simply to exist without being told how fragile she was. At dinner that week, Clara studied her husband across the table. Thomas Hastings, tall and sharp-featured, polished his spectacles as he spoke to a colleague about the latest court case. The men's words were quick and lively, full of politics and industry. No one asked Clara's opinion, though she knew enough from her reading before marriage to join in. She lifted her teacup with careful hands, keeping her posture straight, her face neutral. Inside, she raged. "Clara," Thomas said suddenly, glancing at her, "Dr. Renford tells me you're to continue your rest. No more walks in the park until spring." His tone was gentle, even protective, but Clara heard the finality in it. "Yes, dear," she whispered. Her fork trembled as it touched her plate. No one at the table noticed. Outside the Hastings grand home, London was alive with change. Steam locomotives thundered into new stations, bringing both opportunity and suffocating crowds. The air was heavy with coal dust, but it carried with it ideas, pamphlets, and voices calling for reform. The suffrage movement was stirring, small gatherings of women meeting in private parlors to discuss the unthinkable, the right to vote. They were dismissed in newspapers as hysterical or dangerous, yet their courage sparked whispers among women like Clara, whispers that reached even the hushed corridors of wealthy households. One afternoon, Clara's maid, Eleanor, lingered longer than usual while arranging flowers in her mistress's room. "Beg pardon, ma'am," she said softly, eyes lowered. "But I heard there's to be a meeting at Mrs. Lee's house tonight. Women speaking on matters of Parliament." Clara's heart quickened. It was reckless even to mention such things. But the thought of women gathered, talking freely, boldly, made her chest tighten with something dangerously close to hope. "Thank you, Eleanor," Clara murmured. Her voice was calm, though her hands shook as she folded her lace handkerchief. That night, Clara lay awake long after Thomas's breathing had settled into heavy sleep. The gas lamp in the hall burned low, casting shadows across the walls. She thought of Mrs. Lee's parlor, imagined voices weaving together, women daring to question the rules that had held them captive. The temptation grew unbearable. Clara slipped from bed, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and moved like a phantom down the stairs. The clock in the hallway struck 11 as she opened the side door. For the first time in years, she stepped into the night not as a patient or a possession, but as herself. Mrs. Lee's house stood on a quieter street, a modest townhouse compared to the Hastings' grand estate. Candles glowed through the windows, and when Clara knocked softly, the door opened to reveal a woman with keen gray eyes. "Mrs. Hastings," she whispered, recognizing her. "I wasn't certain you'd come." Clara hesitated on the threshold. Her upbringing, her marriage, her doctor's orders, all weighed heavily upon her. But the warmth of the candlelight and the faint hum of voices within pulled her forward. "I needed to," she said, stepping inside. The parlor was filled with women of all ages. Some wore simple gowns, others fine silks, but all shared the same fire in their eyes. Clara's breath caught as she realized how alive the room felt, so unlike the silent drawing rooms where she usually sat like an ornament. A woman stood at the front, tall and commanding. "This is not about hysteria," she declared. "It is not about weakness. It is about recognition that women are human beings, capable of reason, deserving of rights." Clara sat rigid at first, her hands clasped in her lap. But as the speeches continued, her heart swelled. Here were voices naming the very injustices she had felt but never dared speak aloud. Here were women refusing to be zombies. When the gathering ended, Clara lingered near the door, uncertain if she belonged. But Mrs. Lee approached her. "You look as though you've seen a ghost," she said kindly. "No," Clara replied, her voice trembling. "I think I've finally seen the living." The days that followed were filled with a dangerous tension. Clara returned home with cheeks flushed, her mind racing. But Thomas noticed her newfound restlessness. "You look better," he said one morning, adjusting his cravat. "Perhaps the rest cure is working after all." Clara smiled faintly, but inside she knew her strength was not from confinement, it was from that night in the parlor, from hearing voices unshackled. Still, secrecy weighed heavily upon her. If Thomas discovered her late-night visit, the consequences would be severe. Worse still, if Dr. Renford learned of it, he would surely demand stricter confinement. Meanwhile, London itself seemed to mirror Clara's unease. Strikes broke out in the factories, demanding better conditions. Newspapers carried stories of women poisoned by match production, their jaws glowing faintly in the dark from phosphorus disease. The public called them matchstick girls, another ghostly image of women reduced to shadows by industry. Clara read these reports in secret, her fingers smudged with ink. The parallels to her own life were undeniable. Whether rich or poor, women were being used up, their voices ignored, their bodies treated as tools. The image of the zombie no longer felt like a metaphor. It was a mirror held up to the age itself. One evening, as Clara prepared for yet another formal dinner, Eleanor slipped her a folded paper. "A message from Mrs. Lee," the maid whispered. Clara unfolded it with trembling hands. The note was brief: "We march soon. Will you stand with us?" her pulse thundered in her ears. Marching was no quiet gathering in a parlor, it was public, visible, dangerous. Women had been jeered at, spat on, even dragged by police for less. Yet Clara felt a fire stir in her chest. The image of her hollow reflection in the mirror haunted her still. If she remained silent, would she not become the very ghost society imagined her to be? At dinner that night, Thomas spoke cheerfully of a new case. Clara nodded when expected, but her thoughts were elsewhere. When the servants cleared the dishes, Thomas finally noticed her silence. "Are you unwell again?" he asked, concern creasing his brow. Clara met his gaze. For years, she had whispered yes to every command, every prescription. But tonight, her lips parted to form words that frightened even herself. "I am not unwell, Thomas. I am unfinished." The room fell silent. Thomas stared at her as though she had spoken in a foreign tongue. And in truth, she had, for Victorian women were not meant to speak of themselves at all. That night, Clara lay awake, her mind circling Mrs. Lee's note. She thought of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, of the Matchstick Girls, of countless women whose names history would never record. She thought of herself, pale in the mirror, a shadow of what she could be. The march was coming. The question now was whether Clara Hastings would step into the street alongside her sisters, or retreat back into the suffocating safety of silence. Her decision would shape not only her own fate, but perhaps echo into the lives of women who came after. And as the fog rolled once more through London's narrow lanes, Clara rose quietly from bed, lit a single candle, and set the note from Mrs. Lee upon her desk. Its edges glowed in the flickering flame, the words standing out like a dare. "We march soon. Will you stand with us?" Clara's hand hovered over the page, her heart pounding, as though history itself waited for her answer. The candle flame wavered as Clara Hastings sat at her desk, the folded note from Mrs. Lee burning in her thoughts. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that seemed to press against her ears. Thomas's breathing drifted faintly from the bedroom, steady and oblivious. Clara's hand hovered over the paper. She longed to take up her pen, to write her answer, but her fingers froze. Every part of her life had been shaped by obedience. To write yes would be to defy not only her husband, but the entire order of her society. And yet, she thought, had she not already begun that defiance? She had left the house at night. She had listened to women speak freely. She had dared to say to Thomas, "I am unfinished." Her heart beat faster. She leaned forward, dipped her pen in ink, and let it touch the paper. Days passed in a blur. The Hastings household bustled with dinners, callers, and endless obligations, but Clara carried the secret weight of her reply like a hidden flame. She had written only 2 words, "I will." The note had been returned to Mrs. Lee through Eleanor, discreetly tucked among linens sent for mending. Now there was nothing to do but wait. London itself seemed to be holding its breath. The city groaned under the weight of progress, new factories, new rail lines, new fortunes. But with that progress came unrest. The newspapers carried stories of strikes, protests, and meetings in smoky halls where men argued for rights of labor. For women, the fight was quieter, but no less urgent. Pamphlets appeared, printed cheaply, urging the vote. Some argued that education was the key, others, that the law must change before anything else could. And still, in parlors and kitchens, women whispered about their lives, half-lived, half-seen. Clara felt as though she stood on a threshold between 2 worlds. In one, she was the obedient wife, pale and silent. In the other, she was something unnamed, something dangerous, something alive. One afternoon, while Thomas was away at Chambers, Dr. Renford visited. He arrived in his usual manner, black coat, polished shoes, carrying a leather case of instruments and bottles. "My dear Mrs. Hastings," he said, bowing as he entered her room. "You look rather flushed. I hope you are not exerting yourself?" Clara forced a polite smile. "I have tried to follow your orders, doctor." He settled into a chair, opening his case. "You must understand, rest is your salvation. A woman's constitution is not built for strain. Too much activity, reading, walking, even prolonged conversation, can unbalance the delicate nervous system. I have seen it 100 times. Clara lowered her gaze, but inside, her anger flared. How easily he spoke of fragility, as though women were porcelain. How quickly he dismissed their minds, their desires, their capacity. "Tell me, doctor," she said softly, her voice steady. "Do men not suffer nerves as well?" Renford chuckled. "Men are tempered differently. They are called to work, to public life. Women are called to nurture. Your role is no less important, indeed, the stability of a nation rests upon it. But it requires restraint. Restraint." The word echoed in her skull like a bell. Restraint until her body wasted away. Restraint until her spirit shrank to nothing. "Yes, doctor," she murmured, though her hands curled tightly in her lap. When he left, she exhaled a long, trembling breath. For the first time, she did not believe his words at all. That evening, Thomas remarked that Dr. Renford found her improved. Clara smiled faintly but said nothing. Her mind was already elsewhere, on the march that was coming. The morning of the march arrived gray and damp. Fog clung to the streets, and the clatter of horses echoed like distant drums. Clara dressed with trembling hands, choosing a plain cloak and bonnet. Eleanor stood silently by, her face pale but determined. "Will you be safe, ma'am?" she whispered. Clara touched her maid's hand. "I don't know. But I cannot stay silent." Eleanor nodded. "I'll cover for you." Clara slipped out the side door, her heart racing, her breath sharp in the cold air. The gathering place was a wide square near Westminster. At first, Clara thought she had come too early, the fog concealed much. But as she approached, shapes emerged from the mist. Women. Dozens, then hundreds. Some carried banners stitched by hand. Others clutched pamphlets or held their children close. Their faces were solemn, yet their eyes gleamed with quiet determination. Clara's chest swelled as she joined them. For the first time, she was not alone. Mrs. Lee spotted her and moved swiftly through the crowd. "You came," she said, her gray eyes alight. "I wasn't certain you would." "I nearly didn't," Clara admitted. "But I couldn't bear to be a ghost any longer." Mrs. Lee squeezed her hand. "Then walk with us." The march began slowly, feet shuffling on damp cobblestones. The women moved in unison, their banners lifting into the mist. Onlookers gathered, some jeering, others watching in silence. A few men spat insults, calling them unwomanly, unnatural. Clara's pulse pounded, but she kept walking. Each step felt like defiance. Each breath like victory. As they neared Parliament, the police appeared, uniformed men with stern faces, truncheons at their belts. The crowd stiffened, but Mrs. Lee raised her chin. "We are here in peace," she declared. "We claim only our voices." The officers hesitated. Perhaps they expected violence, but there was none. The women stood quietly, banners swaying in the mist. Clara looked up at the dark stone of Parliament, its towers piercing the fog. How many laws had been written inside, laws that bound women without ever asking their consent? How many voices had been silenced within those walls? Her throat tightened. She felt tears burn at the corners of her eyes, but she did not look away. Suddenly, a shout rang out from the crowd of onlookers. "Go home! Back to your kitchens!" Others echoed it, their jeers rising into a roar. The women held their ground, though some clutched their children tighter. Clara's heart thudded painfully. Fear rose in her chest, but alongside it came something else, a fierce, unyielding strength. She turned to the woman beside her, a young seamstress with calloused hands. Their eyes met, and Clara saw the same fire burning there. They did not move. Hours passed. The women stood in the square, silent yet unshaken, their presence alone a challenge. At last, the officers dispersed. The crowd thinned. The fog deepened, swallowing the day into dusk. Clara returned home under cover of night, her cloak damp with mist, her body trembling from exhaustion. But her spirit blazed. Inside the house, Thomas sat waiting in the parlor, a newspaper folded in his hands. His expression was unreadable as he looked up. "Where have you been?" he asked quietly. Clara froze in the doorway, her pulse leaping. The ink-stained pages on his lap told her everything. The march had already reached the press. "I went," she whispered. Her voice was steady, though her hands shook. "I went to stand with them." Thomas rose slowly, his gaze fixed on her. "You defied me. You defied your doctor. Do you realize what you've risked?" Clara lifted her chin, her heart pounding. "Yes," she said. "For the first time in my life, I do." The silence between them stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, as though the city itself held its breath. Thomas's face darkened, but before he could speak again, a sharp knock rattled the door. Both turned in surprise. The hour was late, and such knocks rarely brought good news. Thomas moved to answer it, his footsteps heavy. Clara's stomach knotted as she listened to the door creak open. A man's voice spoke low and urgent. Then Thomas returned, his face pale. "They want to speak with you," he said, his voice tight. "They know you were there." Clara's heart lurched. Her secret life, her defiance, had reached beyond the shadows. She had stepped into history's gaze, and now, it was staring back at her. The knock on the Hastings door still reverberated in Clara's chest as Thomas turned back to her. His face, usually so carefully composed, now betrayed unease. "They want to speak with you," he repeated, his voice quieter, as though he could scarcely believe the words himself. Clara's throat tightened. Her secret life, her hidden defiance, had not only reached the streets of Westminster, it had followed her home. For a moment, she felt the old instinct rising, to retreat, to obey, to vanish into the stillness expected of her. But something deeper held her ground. "Then let me speak," she said softly, her hands steady despite the storm inside her. Two men stood in the doorway of the parlor when she entered. Both were dressed plainly, their coats damp with fog. One carried a folded newspaper beneath his arm, its ink smudged by drizzle. The other held his hat tightly, as though the weight of the moment pressed upon him. "Mrs. Hastings," the first man began, inclining his head. "We witnessed you at the march today. Your presence has not gone unnoticed." Thomas bristled. "I hardly see why gentlemen such as yourselves should trouble my wife. She is delicate, unwell, her doctor has said as much." Clara felt the sting of his words, the familiar dismissal. But the man's eyes remained on her. Delicate or not, she walked with the women. She stood in silence when others jeered. That speaks louder than illness. The second man shifted uneasily, glancing at Thomas. "There will be consequences, Mrs. Hastings. Already the press has written of women from respectable households joining these disturbances. Names will be spoken. Reputations tested." Clara drew a breath. Her heart thudded painfully, but her voice did not waver. "Then let them speak. For too long, our silence has been taken as consent. It is time someone knew we are not lifeless shadows." The men exchanged a glance, surprised by the firmness in her tone. Thomas's jaw tightened, his anger simmering, but before he could interject, the first man gave a slight bow. "We will remember your words, Mrs. Hastings. Good evening." And with that, they stepped back into the fog, leaving the house colder than before. When the door closed, Thomas turned on her. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice sharp but hushed, as though he feared the servants might overhear. "You think this is bravery? It is recklessness. Do you not understand how fragile your position is, how fragile we are, if society turns its eye upon us?" Clara lifted her chin, though her hands trembled at her sides. "I understand better than you think. I know what it is to be fragile, because I have been made so. But it was not weakness of my own. It was silence. It was being told every day that I am less than what I know myself to be." Thomas stared at her, stunned by the force of her words. For a moment, he seemed almost at a loss. Then he turned away, pacing, his hands gripping the back of a chair. "You sound like them," he muttered. "Like those women who would unravel the very fabric of society." Clara's voice softened, but it did not break. "Perhaps the fabric needs to be unraveled. Woven anew." That night, Clara lay awake long after Thomas had turned from her in silence. The fog pressed against the windows, and the city beyond seemed restless, as though London itself sensed the change stirring within its heart. She thought of the men at the door, of their warning, of the look in their eyes, half caution, half reluctant respect. For the first time, she felt the weight of her choices not only upon herself, but upon others who might look to her. It frightened her. And yet, it filled her with a strange, steady strength. In the days that followed, the household grew tense. Thomas withdrew into his work, leaving earlier, returning later, his silences sharper than words. Clara carried on her routines with outward calm, but her mind burned with restless thought. Letters began to circulate quietly among the women who had marched. Eleanor slipped them into Clara's room when no one was watching, and Clara devoured every word. Plans were forming. Another gathering, larger this time. Perhaps even a petition delivered directly to Parliament. Yet with each note, the sense of risk deepened. The newspapers had grown more hostile. Cartoons mocked the women, portraying them as shrill, skeletal, or unfeminine. The word zombie appeared again, tossed about as insult and caricature. Clara stared at those drawings until her stomach turned. They saw her kind as lifeless creatures, yet she had never felt more alive. One evening, as the fire crackled low, Eleanor lingered by the hearth after arranging the logs. "Ma'am," she said cautiously, "there are rumors of arrests. Some say the next march will not be allowed." Clara looked at her maid, her heart tightening. "Do you believe that will stop them?" Eleanor hesitated, then shook her head. "No, ma'am. But it may make the price heavier." Clara reached for the girl's hand, clasping it firmly. "Then the price must be paid." The following week, Clara attended another meeting at Mrs. Lee's home. The room was packed, the air warm with conviction. Voices rose and fell in urgent debate. "They call us zombies," one woman declared bitterly. "Yet it is they who walk through life blind. They cannot see that we breathe, we think, we ache for more than the narrow cage they've built around us." Clara listened, her own chest tightening with recognition. When the murmurs quieted, she rose slowly, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "They call us lifeless because they have taken our life from us," she said. "But today, I walked among you, and I saw not the dead, but the living. I will not go back to being a ghost in my own house. And neither should any of us." The room erupted in quiet applause, restrained but fervent. Clara felt her cheeks flush, her heart soaring with both fear and exhilaration. But the exhilaration faded when she returned home that night. Thomas was waiting once more, his expression dark. "Another meeting?" he asked, though his voice was flat, as if he already knew. Clara did not deny it. "Yes." He set down the paper he had been holding. "Do you wish to ruin us? To see my name dragged through the mud because my wife cannot remain where she belongs?" Clara's voice was calm, though her eyes burned. "I do not wish to ruin you. I wish to save myself." For a moment, silence hung heavy between them. Then Thomas turned away, his shoulders rigid. "You are not the woman I married," he muttered. Clara's reply was quiet, but unflinching. "No. I am becoming the woman I was meant to be." The tension within the household became unbearable. Servants moved about cautiously, sensing the storm beneath the surface. Dr. Renford returned, his visits colder, his remedies more insistent. He urged Thomas to confine her again, to remove her from corrupting influences. Clara overheard their conversation one afternoon from the hallway. Her blood ran cold at the words. "She is ill, Hastings," Renford insisted. "She requires stricter measures. Otherwise she will be lost to delusions entirely." Lost to delusions. Clara's fists clenched as she listened. No, she thought fiercely. She was not deluded. She was waking. Another letter arrived from Mrs. Lee. This one bore urgency in every line. The petition is ready. We will march it to Parliament within the fortnight. We must show them we're not shadows, but voices. Clara held the letter to her chest, her decision already forming. But as she tucked it away, the door creaked behind her. Thomas stood there, watching. His eyes fell on the paper in her hands. "What is that?" he asked sharply. Clara froze, her heart racing. The turning point she had dreaded was here. She met his gaze, her breath steadying despite the pounding in her chest. "It is the future," she said quietly. "And I intend to be part of it." Thomas's face hardened, his voice cold. "Not while you are my wife." Clara's lips parted, her pulse thundering. For the first time, she understood that her struggle was not only against society, or doctors, or gossiping neighbors. It was against the very roof above her head. And as she stood there, clutching the letter to her chest, she realized the choice before her was no longer distant. It was immediate, urgent, unavoidable. The march was coming. And with it, a decision that could change everything. Clara stood in the parlor with the letter pressed to her chest, Thomas's words echoing like iron bars closing around her. "Not while you are my wife." Her breath came shallow, yet steady. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, its silence heavy with unspoken threats. But within her, a flame burned brighter than fear. This was no longer about secret meetings or whispered letters. This was about whether she would live as a ghost, or step into her life fully awake. The morning of the march dawned gray and cold, the fog curling low over the Thames. Clara dressed quietly in her dark coat and bonnet, her hands trembling as she fastened the buttons. Every movement felt deliberate, final. When she entered the hall, Thomas was waiting by the door. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed from sleeplessness. "You cannot go," he said flatly. "I forbid it." Clara met his gaze, her heart breaking at the distance between them, the gulf that had widened with each passing day. "You may forbid my steps," she whispered, "but not my will. I cannot remain still while others march for me." He reached out as though to stop her, but his hand faltered, dropping to his side. Something in her eyes, resolve he had never seen, held him frozen. And so she walked past him, the door closing behind her with a quiet finality that felt like the turning of a key. The streets swelled with women. Some were young, their eyes alight with fire. Others bore lines of age, their expressions hardened by years of silence. Together, they formed a tide that pushed steadily through London, their footsteps rhythmic, their banners held high. Clara joined them, her breath sharp in the chill air. At her side, Eleanor appeared suddenly, her plain shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. "I could not let you go alone, ma'am," she said with quiet defiance. Clara gripped her maid's hand, gratitude rising in her chest. They moved together, shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of others, their voices hushed but unyielding. As they neared Westminster, the crowd thickened. Policemen lined the streets, their batons gleaming, their faces stern. Some jeered from the sidewalks, men shouting insults, waving newspapers with grotesque caricatures. "Zombies," they cried, their voices cruel. "Back to your graves, where you belong." The words struck Clara like stones, but she lifted her chin. Around her, women tightened their grips on one another's arms. If they were to be called lifeless, then today they would show what life truly meant. At last, they reached the steps of Parliament. The petition, thousands of signatures bound in thick leather, was carried forward by Mrs. Lee herself. The crowd hushed, the air trembling with anticipation. Clara's heart pounded. This was the moment they had risked everything for. But then, a commotion rippled through the crowd. A line of policemen surged forward, their voices barking orders. "Disperse! You have no right to gather here." Shouts rose, panic scattering through the front ranks. Eleanor clutched Clara's arm, fear flashing in her eyes. The officers advanced, their batons raised. And in that instant, Clara felt a calm clarity settle over her. She stepped forward, her voice rising clear above the noise. "We are not shadows," she cried. "We are not the dead you name us. We are living, and we will be heard." The crowd roared in response, voices lifting as one. Women who moments before had shrunk back now surged forward, their cries echoing against the stone walls of Parliament. The policeman hesitated, startled by the sudden force of unity. And in that hesitation, Mrs. Lee climbed the steps, the petition raised high. Time seemed to still. The great doors of Parliament loomed above, heavy and unyielding. But when Mrs. Lee laid the petition upon the threshold, it was as though centuries of silence cracked open. The crowd erupted, cheers, sobs, the raw sound of lives breaking free from invisibility. Clara felt tears blur her vision, her hand clutching Eleanor's tightly. In that moment, she was no longer a patient, no longer a ghost. She was a voice among voices, alive in the truest sense. News of the march spread swiftly. The newspapers spat their venom, calling the women unnatural, hysterical, zombies who sought to infect the living order of society. But behind the ink and scorn, something undeniable had shifted. Clara returned home that evening exhausted but alight. Thomas waited once more in the parlor, his face unreadable. "I heard what happened," he said quietly. "They call you reckless. They call you names I will not repeat." Clara stood before him, her shoulders square. "They may call me what they wish. But they will never again call me silent." For a long moment, Thomas simply stared at her. At last, he looked away, his voice heavy with something between defeat and awe. "You are not the woman I thought I married." Clara's reply was gentle, but unshakable. "No. I am more." The years that followed did not bring immediate victory. The laws did not bend overnight, nor did society embrace them at once. But seeds had been sown. What began as whispers grew into movements, into debates, into change. Clara continued to walk among them, her presence quiet yet steady. Eleanor rose too, her once timid voice gaining strength until she became a speaker in her own right. And though the world persisted in mocking them as zombies, Clara understood the truth. The word, meant to strip them of life, had become a mark of defiance. For what they called lifeless was, in fact, the stirring of something too long buried. On a late evening years later, Clara sat by her window overlooking the fog-bound Thames. She thought of that first march, of the jeers and the banners, of the petition laid upon Parliament steps. She thought of Thomas, still distant, yet no longer attempting to cage her spirit. She thought of the countless women whose names would never appear in history books, yet whose footsteps had echoed alongside hers. And she smiled. For she knew, deep within, that history would not remember them as the dead. It would remember them as the ones who rose. Who walked when told to sit. Who spoke when told to be silent. Who lived when the world insisted they were lifeless. The so-called zombies of Victorian England were nothing less than the first pulse of a greater awakening. And Clara Hastings, once a ghost in her own home, now breathed fully in the truth she had fought to claim. That she was, and had always been, alive.